Mark used and Matthew used, which is still a Greek source, because they're verbatim. So they clearly, it's not by accident. They didn't just accidentally write exactly the same words in the exact same order.
Well, I'm suggesting there's enough difference to validate the claim that they are eyewitness testimony that's been written down within an oral community, controlled
that
within
can't be
that
true
community.
In Greek, though, because Greek is a translation. So who translated it? I mean, you're assuming that somehow magically people completely separate from – this is another Septuagint miracle, that somehow separately people, unbeknownst to each other, translated this Hebrew tradition into Greek and ended up with exactly identical Greek texts independent of each other?
These are apostles who are eyewitnesses who certainly – spoke Greek, used the Septuagint.
Why are they identical? That's what I don't understand, is the text of Matthew and the text of Mark. I mean, in any other field of history, in any other subject in history, we know that's copying or common source. No one would suggest that they spontaneously, independent of each other, wrote down exactly the same words in the exact same order for pages and pages, right?
Well, that's fascinating because
I'm confused what your position is.
Well, that's fascinating because it seems like the accusation is that they are so different that there's all these contradictions.
Well, there are also contradictions, but there are also.
So are they the same or are they different, though?
They're both.
Are they identical or are they different?
No. Oh, come on, they're both things, because you have huge stretches of text that are identical, and then suddenly Matthew changes something. That creates a contradiction, and that's what makes Matthew not Mark. That's how Matthew is different from Mark. But there are some large stretches of text that are identical, and there's large stretches of text that are identical between Matthew and Luke as well, in Greek. Which means they have to have used a common source or each other. And either way, it's a Greek source, not a Hebrew source. There may be some Hebrew or Aramaic in there somewhere way back, but it's clearly not the sources they're using.
It doesn't mean that there's a common core of history there that they're telling that would have been memorized by the disciples.
There has to be some
had mnemonic devices within what he was teaching, what he's saying, and this.
But it has to be a common single person, one single source who created the Greek translation that they're using, right? That's the only way that they could be identical in the Greek. They can't be orally transmitted and just magically be the same. There had to be one translator that they're working from.
Apparently you don't know much about an oral community then if you're making that assertion. Oral communities are going to have...
translation. They didn't start in Greek, right? So they didn't start teaching the gospel in Greek. They were teaching in Hebrew.
Did. Yeah, they started in Greek. Sure they did.
So you think literally from the beginning it was all in Greek?
The disciples, Jesus, they were Hellenist Jews, and the
disciples coordinated amongst each other and said, okay, so we're going to tell exactly the same Greek text, word for word, same order, everything. Okay, go forth. And then they sent the missionaries out, and that's where the Greek text comes from? That's your theory, is what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that the Greek text comes from the fact that eyewitnesses wrote down this core of history that was memorized within. Well, we're told Matthew wrote in Hebrew, but why would it make
sense? How can Matthew have been written in Hebrew and been translated into Greek, and yet Mark has exactly the same Greek? I mean, you would have to propose that Mark was copying Matthew.
I just don't see why. There are 40% difference in all the Gospels.
Yeah, but we're talking about the parts that are identical. The parts that are identical can't be identical by accident. I'm trying to understand what your theory is. How did Mark and Matthew both get huge chunks of text that are identical word for word in Greek? That's not possible if Matthew was translated from Hebrew. Unless you propose that Mark is a copy or a redaction of Matthew. Then you have Hebrew, then you have Matthew, then you have Mark.
I'm proposing that just as Papias suggests that there was a very early Matthew, it didn't necessarily need to be copied by Mark. Mark, we know, was the amanuensis of Peter through church tradition. And so we have Peter's accounting. I see them as three basically independent retellings of a core of history that was in a oral tradition that had a significant amount of this stuff memorized. If you look at the Greek, I'm sure you have, Jesus spoke in meter. He spoke in ways that could be memorized.
Independent if they're identical. The Greek is identical. That proves that they're not independent. That they have one source, one person crafted the parts that are identical across Matthew, Luke, and Mark, for example. One person had to craft that. It can't have been multiple people, and they had to have crafted it in Greek.
Why can't I independently write down the lyrics of Tom Sawyer by Rush, and Steve do the same thing, and need to think that somehow we must have got together in order to write out the memory.
Rush wrote it.
Well, it was actually Geddy Lee and Neil Peart, by the way, but one of my all-time favorite songs in history. Yes.
But all I'm saying is that, and we're probably getting bogged down here, and probably need to move on.
I'm confused.
But
I don't.
You can never go wrong talking about Rush. So continue.
That's debatable.
Oh yeah, I forgot. The one person in the planet that doesn't like Rush, Kyle.
Well, I have a different tack we could go on then. Because the other question was the 1 Corinthians thing, right? So there's a lot that could be said about that, but the one thing that I have a difficulty with, and a lot of scholars, I'm not the only one, you have Ludeman and others, is the assumption that what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 15 is exactly what's in the Gospels. And of course, you're working from that assumption that you get to from some argument. But I think a lot of scholars don't assume that that's the case, that they assume the Gospels are developed tradition. And what Paul is referring to, he doesn't talk about, for example, the resurrected Jesus eating with people or hanging out with them for days on end. Right? He only talks about like momentous visions. And in fact, only one occasion he says that they appeared to all of them at once, and to hundreds of people all at once. But we don't know what he means by appear. So he doesn't give us a description. Does he mean a light in the sky that people interpreted as Jesus? What exactly does he mean? And this is the problem.
Do you know what the Greek is? Do you know what the Greek is right there, right off the top of your head? I don't. I'm asking.
Oh, talking about the appeared or which part? Ophthe.
Yeah, appeared.
It's ophthe, which is passive to see. It's common for visions. A lot of visions are referred to as when gods appear or manifest. They're often the verb ophthe can be used for that.
Sure. Right. So you're suggesting that 1 Corinthians 15, that Habermas speaks about in his minimal facts, that the majority of New Testament scholars hold to these minimal facts, and one of them is that that Paul is what he received, he's passing on of holy tradition in the same manner. Paul was a Pharisee. And so he's receiving.
That's not one of the minimal facts. I thought you were going to say the appearances were the minimal facts. That I think is true.
Well, I was just referring to Habermas, and then in the context of him talking about that, he talks about 1 Corinthians 15.
I mean, we could talk about what he means there in terms of received tradition, but the problem, the conundrum that we face as historians is what received tradition. Was it the same as in the Gospels, or was it something else? The Gospels are, a whole lifetime later by ancient standards. So we really can't necessarily connect them. We can't tell that what Paul meant by the tradition that he was handed on, or if that was the case, that what these people saw is the same thing as what gets narrated in the Gospels. We can't connect those two. We don't have the necessary data we would need to connect those two. Like we couldn't do it in a court of law for sure. This stuff would be thrown out as hearsay by standards of federal evidence. But
I think Simon Greenleaf would disagree.
Yeah, but
who made Harvard Law what it is today back in the day.
He was ignoring the federal rules of evidence, which you can just Google that, federal rules of evidence, and you can actually look it up as to what's required to authenticate a document for it to be presented in court. The Gospels don't pass. I'll
have to look into that. There's a lot of assertions you've made that I would like to look into.
No, definitely. Federal rules of evidence. What does it take for a document to be entered into court? You can read all about it online. You'll find that this requirements are extremely strict. In fact, they're too strict for ancient history in general. So ancient historians, even for secular history, can't abide by the standards of evidence in a court of law, which means we accept that our results are less certain. So that's a common thing, is like we don't have the confidence and certainty that we would have in the result of a court trial, for example. But
so do you throw out all ancient history? Do you throw that out?
we approach it from a case-by-case basis and degrees of uncertainty. So there's lots of things that we trust, but we don't trust it like we're not going to bet our lives on it because we know there's a lot of ways this evidence can come to have been compromised. So we have degrees of confidence depending on what type of evidence we're dealing with, what type of claim we're dealing with, and so on. So it's not a straightforward like we accept or reject. It's a question of analysis.
Yeah. Well, I'm while I disagree. You certainly pause for a moment and take account when you disagree with somebody who that's their profession and that's their expertise. So, I respectfully, disagree with you on a lot of what you said, but I'm going to look into it.
You might find interesting. I just published an article on my blog like last week, I think, on the evidence for Hannibal versus the evidence for Jesus. Now, you would disagree with how I categorize the evidence for Jesus, so that's fine. But you'll find interesting to see what conclusions we come to regarding the existence of Hannibal and why, and the different kinds of evidence. And there are different levels of quality. Some are better evidence, some are worse evidence. It depends, right? So there's different qualities.
Sure.
And so you might find that useful if you want to see like how historians actually look at these things. That's one place to start. Like I said, it is our evidence situation for ancient history is worse than courts of law. So
right. Well, here's the thing: when we talk about this stuff, I'm going to be quoting the guys that you've directly debated. So I'm going to quote Lacona. I'm going to quote Habermas. So. In this instance, I can only say, with a smile, I disagree.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Right.
But yeah. So if I can pose some questions to you, just to kind of get back maybe a little further with some, epistemology starting points. Mm-hmm. You said you're an atheist. Were you ever a theist? What's your history as far as your relationship to theism?
Yeah, people who want the whole story, I have a whole chapter on it in Sense and Goodness Without God, so you can get all the details there. I was like a really vague theist when I was a child, but then I also thought trees had souls and I could talk to them. So I don't really take that seriously as a reasoned position. My only true faith that I've ever had, the only religion that I really believed in, and I was nominally Christian because my family went to church and stuff, but they didn't require me to believe, and I didn't really have a faith belief in Christianity. And the church I went to didn't really require that either. It was very liberal. It was just the moral message was more important than the literal stuff. So my first real religion, though, I was converted by a powerful religious experience that I would have called at the time a miracle to Taoism. So I was a believing Taoist for many years, all the way into my military service. In fact, that was my stated religion in service was Taoist, and I went to boot camp with my own handwritten Tao Te Ching as my religious text. And I did meditation. I experienced altered states of consciousness. I studied the philosophy. And I have good feelings about what that religion did to me. Like it taught me a lot of things, made me a calmer, better person, made my life happier. And then I realized it was false. It took me a while to come to that conclusion. I wasn't angry that I'd been misled, but it just led to an evolution in my thinking. Which is different. My experience is different from a lot of atheists who come from a fundamentalist background and then get really angry because they've been lied to their whole life is how they feel, right? I didn't have that sort of hostile experience, and it was until later in life when I became an adult and a voter that I started to run into the problem of fundamentalism, where all the social issues I'm trying to fight for, the people in my way at the time were always Christians. And so that was a new phenomenon for me that I had to figure out. So I came late to that thing. And at that time I was a Taoist, and I just came to atheism later. But that was at the same time getting involved in my interaction with religion more as an atheist. Those all evolved at the same time. And then later, eventually, I started, becoming an atheist activist. Was editor-in-chief of the Secular Web for some years and things like that. And gosh, I'm talking ancient history. This is like 20 years ago.
Taoism is fundamentally atheistic anyway. There's no belief in a
it's hard to categorize.
Divine being.
Yeah, because it's not a personal being, but it is still the belief in a force or power. Yeah, it's more like an organic consciousness or a vegetative consciousness. It does take the role of God in many ways, but it is not.
So you were a Jedi, or Were you just a Padawan, or were you a Jedi master?
Obviously, there are similarities because they based Jedi religion on Eastern religion. So that's the ancestry there. But no, I was doing the real thing. So
now, just for clarification, because I've had this discussion with Kenny before. But Kenny, you come from a classical theist point of view, right? If somebody doesn't accept the classical version of a god, then you would not consider them to be a theist, even if they have a god belief, correct?
Right. To me,